Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The government has discontinued funding to the Keeping Women Safe in Their Homes program, which helps protect women who have experienced family violence. This program improves security for women and children, including changing the locks on the front door and sweeping for listening devices in the home. Australian women shouldn't have to choose between staying at home or staying safe. So will the Prime Minister match Labor's announcement from yesterday and commit $18 million to continue support for this vital program?
Yeah. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As the Leader of the Opposition would know, that this is a program that had a set period of funding, and we are in the process of working through the consultation phase of how that funding can be extended, and we're working through that in the normal budgetary process, Mr Speaker. And it is still funded till June, Mr Speaker, and we are providing that funding for all of these essential services to address the serious issue of preventing domestic violence. Now, Mr Speaker, preventing domestic violence is a shared commitment of every single person in this place. And, Mr Speaker, I must say I'm a little disappointed that the Leader of the Opposition would seek to make some political capital of this issue in this place. Mr Speaker, our national plan to reduce violence against women and their children from 2010 to 22 is a commitment from all governments through COAG. It will again be addressed at the COAG meeting later this year. Since the national plan has been in place, the Commonwealth has invested over $700 million to reduce domestic, family and sexual violence. Yesterday, we announced an additional $10.9 million for the 1-800 Respect number service. The funding will boost the number of counsellors to ensure people can receive help when they need it. In 2017-18, 1-800 Respect answered almost 100,000 telephone and online contacts, which was a 54% increase from the previous year, and this year the service is expected to answer more than 160,000 such contacts. And through the Women's Safety Package, the Commonwealth gave some states and territories supplementary funding for the Keeping Women Safe in Their Homes and Local Support Coordinators program. Now, Mr Speaker, we are getting on with the job of delivering these essential services, and we are committed and should be committed as an entire parliament, together with state and territory governments, to address the very serious issue of addressing domestic family violence. We're committed to that, Mr Speaker. I have no doubt that other members of this place, those who sit opposite, those who sit in the crossbench, are also committed to this. And I would ask that we continue to address these issues in a bipartisan way and not seek to play politics with it.
The member for Bonner has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how the government's plan to keep our economy strong is guaranteeing the essential services Australians rely on without having to increase taxes?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bonner. Our plan for a stronger economy, which we've had in place for 5 years, Mr Speaker, continues to work. It's working. It's built on some solid and fundamental principles that the Liberal and National parties believe in to our core, Mr Speaker, and that is if you have a go, you get a go, Mr Speaker. And also that you don't lift some people up in this country by bringing other people down through the politics of envy that is riddled through every single policy proposal that you see on the economy come forward from the Labor Party. Our plan for a stronger economy has got unemployment down to 5%, Mr Speaker. It has got 50,000 people off the unemployment queues that were on them at the last election. It has ensured that the budget that we will hand down before the next election, that the Treasurer will hand down, will be the first surplus budget in 12 years, Mr Speaker. It's a budget that will be supported by a growing economy, Mr Speaker, not higher taxes. Not higher taxes, Mr Speaker. Almost 2 million people have got a job over the last 5 years under the economic policies of this government, the Liberal National Government, Mr Speaker. And on top of that, over 100,000 young people got a job in the last financial year, which was the strongest year of youth jobs growth in Australia's recorded economic history. And on top of that, Mr Speaker, our economic policies mean that working-age population dependence on welfare, people, Australians of working age in this country, have the lowest dependence on welfare at less than 15% than we've seen in 25 years, Mr Speaker. Our plan for a stronger economy is working, and that means we can invest in the essential services that Australians rely on. Additional $37 billion, Mr Speaker, for schools over the next 10 years, an additional $30 billion for hospitals over the next 5 years. Some $7 billion has been made available to support our farmers in drought and rural and regional communities, 1,900 new and amended drugs listings, and $1.4 billion in the last budget to support new drugs listings, Mr Speaker, and $1 billion extra going in every year into aged care. Now, we are doing all of that, Mr Speaker, without increasing taxes, Mr Speaker. We're doing it because we know how to run a strong economy. Now, those opposite, their $200 billion in higher taxes that they want to impose on the Australian people if they win the next election is an admission that they do not know how to run a stronger economy, Mr Speaker. They do not know how to run a strong budget, Mr Speaker. The Australian people know that they cannot trust Labor with money, and they cannot trust them when it comes to letting them keep more of the money they earn. The Labor Party are the party for higher taxes under Labor, lower taxes under the Liberals.
The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that since moving on Malcolm Turnbull, the government has cancelled Parliament because it couldn't decide who was the Prime Minister, lost 2 government members and its majority, and next year is going to run a part-time Parliament? Has the government given up on even pretending to govern, and why isn't Malcolm Turnbull still the Prime Minister of Australia?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Labor Party is so cocky that he thinks all he has to do to become Prime Minister is come in here and ask the same question every day, Mr Speaker. That's how cocky he has become. He thinks he can just walk into the job of Prime Minister, Mr Speaker, without explaining to the Australian people why he wants to take a $200 billion tax sledgehammer to the Australian economy. He thinks he doesn't have to explain to the Australian people how taking our industrial relations arrangements back to the 1970s, Mr Speaker, to reintroduce division and conflict in our workplaces is somehow supposed to support bringing Australians together to make a stronger economy, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, what we know of this Leader of the Opposition is he thinks that he can just so simply become the Prime Minister of this country that he can just give up on growing the Australian economy and have one policy that might seek to grow the Australian economy. He thinks the way to deliver essential services in this country is just to tax Australians more. That is a confession that he does not know how to run a strong budget and he does not know how to oversee a strong economy. But I can tell him again what our government has been getting on with the job of doing, whether it was announcing the new city deal up in Darwin, Mr Speaker, which will be ensuring a better standard of living and livelihood of people living in our tropical capital, Mr Speaker. The fact that we've finalised negotiations on the Hong Kong Free Trade Agreement, that we've put $300 million over the next 4 years to reduce red tape for small businesses. And, Mr Speaker, that we were ensuring that we're delivering on ensuring that small businesses get paid on time and that their payment terms go from 30 days down to 20 days, Mr Speaker, that the women of this country can continue to expect the support of our government as we see record levels of female participation in the workforce and the gender pay gap coming down to record lows, that we are providing security and safety for Australians by introducing into this House legislation that will cancel the citizenship of people who engage in terrorist acts, whether they're terrorists that come from a radical Islamic extremist view, Mr Speaker, that is the most dangerous form of religious extremism in this country. If we believe they have another citizenship and they have committed a terrorist act, we will cancel their citizenship. And on top of that, we will introduce temporary exclusion orders to ensure that returning foreign fighters do not get to come back into this country and wreak havoc. This is a government that knows how to keep our economy strong, how to keep Australians safe, Mr Speaker, and we are getting on with the job of doing all of those things. This is an arrogant and cocky leader of the opposition who thinks all he has to do is turn up in Parliament, throw a few zingers
Prime
around,
Minister's time
and
has concluded. Members on my left, member for Isaacs, the member for Reid.
My question, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the minister update the House how the government is delivering essential transport infrastructure that Australians need without having to increase taxes, including building game-changing infrastructure in Western Sydney?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the member for Reid full well knows how important the Western Sydney Airport is. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity for Australia.
Member for Macarthur is warned.
Once-in-a-generation opportunity, a $5 billion investment. Mr Speaker, there's $3 billion worth of enabling supporting infrastructure, including roads. During the construction period, there's going to be 11,000 jobs created, 11,000 jobs. And once the airport is completed, 28,000 direct and indirect jobs created from this piece of nation-building infrastructure. The Prime Minister knows how important it is. He turned the first sod for the Western Sydney Airport in September. Because, Mr Speaker, when we say, as Liberals and Nationals, that we're going to do something, you know what? We get on and we do it. When we say we're going to lower taxes for small and medium family enterprise businesses, Mr Speaker, we do it. We don't just say it, we do it. We live by our creed. We live by our credo. We get on and we do it. And when we say we're going to help small and family and big business too, small and family enterprises create 1 million jobs in 5 years, well, you know what? We do it. We don't just say it, we do it. Mr Speaker, when we say we're going to lower taxes, we don't just say it, we do it. Now, Western Sydney Airport is not Sydney's second airport, it's Western Sydney's first airport. And it is going to create so much hope and opportunity and enterprise in Western Sydney. Now, the member for Reid knows full well how many jobs and opportunities this is going to create. This 24-hour airport is going to create 24 hours of jobs, 24 hours of enterprise, 24 hours of industrious activity in Western Sydney. And I'm sure that those opposite who represent that Western Sydney Airport area, I'm sure that they're going to be cheering this home too, as well they should. The members for Lindsay, the member for Macquarie, the member for Chifley, because they know how many jobs and opportunities this is going to create. Mr Speaker, we're getting on with building the infrastructure that Australians want, need, expect and deserve. And just last week I was in the member for Parkes' electorate talking to those people about Inland Rail, Mr Speaker. The Inland Rail, a 1,700-kilometre corridor of commerce, Mr Speaker. This nation, the first plans for Inland Rail were drawn up in 1905. And it's taken a Liberal National— yeah, whoa, she says, whoa, the member for Barton says. She's excited about it, as well she should, because it's not just about regional Australia this is going to benefit, it is about Melbourne, it is about Brisbane, it is about easing congestion on our roads. And just like the Western Sydney Airport is going to ease congestion around Kingsford Smith, so too is the Inland Rail going to ease congestion, making sure that people get home sooner and safer on our roads. We're building the aviation, we're building the Inland Rail, we're getting on and building the roads, because we don't just say it, we don't just talk about it, we do it.
The member for McMahon has the call.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Why has the Treasurer cancelled at the last minute his planned trip to meet with his international counterparts at the G20, the leading forum of the world's major economies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, as the member for McMahon would know, it's a leaders' meeting, Mr Speaker. It's a leaders' meeting, and the Treasurers and the Finance Ministers were at the recent
Members
meeting
on
in
my
Bali. We were at the recent meeting in Bali. And the member for McMahon would know
Treasurer
that
will
I was
pause
at
for
the
a second.
recent meeting.
Members on my left will cease interjecting. Treasurer has the call. Treasurer has the call.
Thank you. And the member for McMahon would know at the recent G20 IMF World Bank meeting of finance and treasurers in Bali, Australia's economy was revered for its strong economic growth. The IMF, the OECD, the World Bank praised this strong Australian economy. Our relatively low levels of debt, our falling taxes, our falling unemployment and our strong economic growth, Mr Speaker. That is the result of good economic management that the coalition has undertaken over the last 5 years. And when the Prime Minister represents this country at the G20 over the weekend, the Finance Minister will be with him. And he has been at the last 3 meetings, Mr Speaker, of the G20.
The member for Chifley is warned.
And the Prime Minister will be reminding
Treasurer
all the other
pause.
leaders
The member for Chifley will
of
leave
the strong
under
Australian
Treasurer
economy.
pause. The member for Chifley will leave under Treasurer. Just stop talking for a second. Thank you. The member for Chifley will leave under 94A. The member for McEwen is warned. The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you. As the Prime Minister reminds me, the member for McMahon struggles when it comes to international countries because he put out a press release about the Labor's lead in support for the Varghese report, which said we support increasing trade between Australia and Indonesia. The only problem is that the Varghese report was about Australia and India, Mr Speaker. Nearly as good as the member for Sydney, who thought Africa was a country, Mr Speaker. And the final thing I would say is the thing about the Prime Minister and his ministers and his government is that when we go overseas, we talk Australia up, Mr Speaker. Right. But the member for Fedder, when he writes about Australia overseas, he talks it down, Mr Speaker. He talks it down. He went and said to the investors of the world through the New York Times, don't come here and invest in the Australian economy. Don't support regional jobs. Don't support Australia's growth record. Forget about what The Economist has said about how Aussie rules the world and Australia rules the world. Forget all about that, Mr Speaker, because they want to talk down the Australian economy, whereas the Liberal and the National parties, we talk Australia up and we have a proud record of which to do so.
The member for McMahon, what's the member for Fenner doing? Members on my right. The member for McMahon seeking to table a document.
I am, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to table the transcript of the Treasurer on the 9th of November talking about the important issues he will be discussing with his Finance Minister colleagues at the G20.
The member for McMahon will resume his seat. I'm not even going to ask whether leave's granted. It's a public document. The member for Fenner is seeking to table a document.
Mr Speaker, I seek leave to table an article by the member for Kooyong, published on the UK Spectator website.
The member for Fenner will resume his seat. Member for Fenner will resume his seat. It's called getting warned. The member for Kennedy.
Treasurer, biggest farm in Australia, Van Diemen's Dairies, owned by China. Second biggest Cubby, owned by China. Biggest grain farm, Nicoletti, owned by China. Biggest farming aggregation, Kidmans, controlled by China. Biggest of all stage 2 and 3, owned by China. Australia's most strategic port, Darwin, owned by China. Tax hire industry, Uber, foreign-owned. Car manufacturing, glass, textiles, petrol, white goods, all gone overseas. To we Australians, free trade means jobs exported, cheap labour imported. Treasurer, do we have a new regime that won't continue to sell off Australia, or is it business as usual, Australia for sale?
Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank the member for Kennedy for his question. Foreign investment, Mr Speaker, is absolutely critical to lifting Australia's living standards, to jobs and to growth in the Australian economy. And it's about meeting the savings gap that we have in Australia, which is about 3.5% of GDP, which is the difference between our domestic savings and the investment opportunities. Now, we have put in place a number of safeguards around the agriculture space in relation to foreign investment. We're now requiring more transparency and openness around the sales process. When it comes to critical infrastructure, we take the advice and the input that comes not only from the Foreign Investment Review Board led by David Irvine, but also from the Critical Infrastructure Committee, which involves a number of the leading agencies. So I'd say to the member for Kennedy, it's about getting the balance right. And that balance is about foreign investment, which is in Australia's national interest. It's a very serious topic. It's not a free-for-all. There's considered opinions and inputs that are taken, and whether it's in the agriculture space or in critical infrastructure or other aspects of the Australian economy, the Morrison government, the Liberal and National government, will always take decisions that are in the national interest.
The member for Barara.
My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on how the government's plan to keep our economy strong is guaranteeing the essential services Australian families rely on without raising taxes? Is the Treasurer aware of any risks to the future prosperity of Australian families?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for Barara for his question, a hard-working local member who supports a strong economy. Now, Mr Speaker, when the Liberal and National government came to power, we inherited an economy where unemployment was going up, investment was in freefall, and debt was growing at more than 30% per year, locking in decades of recklessly high government spending growth. Now, in contrast, after 5 years of hard decisions at the ERC and across government, we have seen unemployment fall to 5%. We have created more than 1 million new jobs. We've had our AAA credit rating reaffirmed by the leading credit rating agencies, Mr Speaker. We've also seen wages increase with the biggest jump in 3 years, and we've seen GDP growth at 3.4% through the year, which is the fastest rate since the height of the mining boom. And as the Prime Minister has told this place, the next budget we deliver will be a budget surplus, Mr Speaker. A budget surplus. Now, that is in stark contrast to those opposite. Because the last time the Labor Party delivered a budget surplus was 1989, Mr Speaker. The Berlin Wall was still standing, Mr Speaker. Taylor Swift was born, Mr Speaker. The last time Labor delivered a budget surplus was 1989. And I thought to myself, what went wrong? What went wrong with those 4 surpluses that the member for Lilley announced in this chamber, Mr Speaker? Well, I found the answer, Mr Speaker, in this book, Kevin Rudd, The PM Years, Mr Speaker. Because this is what Kevin Rudd had to say about the member for Lilley. The member for Lilley lacked cerebral horsepower, Mr Speaker, and the basic intellectual software capable of being trained, Mr Speaker. That is what Kevin Rudd, the former Labor Prime Minister, thought of the member for Lilley. So, Mr Speaker, we are growing the Australian economy, we are creating jobs, we are cutting taxes. The next choice at the next election will be between a Labor Party and $200 billion of higher taxes and a Liberal national government that has delivered lower unemployment and more than 1.1 million new jobs.
The member for Cowan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Treasurer. I refer to reports that the Treasurer has cancelled his planned trip to meet with his international counterparts at the G20 because of government chaos and division. Now, given the Treasurer's recent success as a cinematographer, has the Treasurer considered sending a video message to the G20 instead?
Treasurer has occurred.
Both the Prime Minister and I are having a session with Mark Humphrey shortly. But look, the reality is the economy is a serious business. The Australian economy and the jobs of more than 100,000 young people who have been put in a job as a result of a strong economy that we have helped create is a serious business. Now, the Labor Party left this government an economy where there was unemployment that was rising, investment that was in free fall, and debt was rising. And as the Deputy Prime Minister reminds this place, confidence was falling. Now, Mr Speaker, in contrast, we have delivered what Liberal and National parties do. More jobs, lower taxes and unemployment, which is now at its lowest level since 2012. The Prime Minister will represent this country at the G20 meeting, accompanied by the Finance Minister, and he will be talking Australia up, unlike the Labor Party, which talks Australia down.
The member for Ford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy. Will the Minister update the House on how the government is working to bring down electricity prices without having to increase taxes, ensuring reliable electricity for Australians? And what impact will alternative approaches have?
The Minister for Energy has the call.
Well, I thank the member for Ford for his question, and it was great to spend time recently in his electorate in Queensland talking to small businesses about the rip-offs that have been imposed on them by the big energy companies in Queensland. Big energy companies, incidentally, that are owned by the Queensland Labor government. So it turns out the Labor governments want higher prices, they want higher electricity prices, and in the last year they ripped over $2 billion out of hard-working families and small businesses in Queensland, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, the government has a strong plan for affordable, reliable energy for Australian families and hard-working small businesses. Our pressure on the big energy companies is delivering, and we saw a couple of weeks ago AGL offering discounts of 10% to its standing offer customers. That means 150,000 families and 27,000 small businesses will be better off. And just yesterday, Energy Australia announced discounts of 15% on standing offers, and that'll be focused on concessional customers, and that includes older customers who don't have the ability to spend time to negotiate with those companies every year. Now, Mr Speaker, we said that we would deliver on lower electricity prices, and that is exactly what we're doing. And on top of those initiatives, we'll bring forward big stick legislation to the parliament that will hold the energy companies to account. Legislation that you are not supporting because you sit on the side of the big energy companies. And, Mr Speaker, we will underwrite 24/7 reliable supply in the market. Now, Mr Speaker, in contrast, those opposite want higher electricity prices. And the member for Isaac was outed. He was outed yesterday. He was trying to hide carbon tax 2.0 when he said, I'm not going to rule it in or rule it out. And the member for Shorten, I heard this one live. I was sitting in my car. I almost drove off the road when I heard it. The member for Shorten confirmed in an interview last Thursday that their policy is an implied carbon price, a sneaky hidden carbon price, Mr Speaker, a sneaky hidden carbon price. And then the member for Port Adelaide, Mr Speaker, the Shadow Minister for Energy himself, when asked by Lee Sales on the 7:30 report, she said, will Labor's policy include a carbon tax? He said, it will cover all the other sectors of the economy apart from electricity. Well, that's agriculture, that's manufacturing, that's transport. They're the sectors that we will back. They're the sectors that we will support because we believe in lower electricity.
The Minister's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, the member for Curtin said, given that we've had so much uncertainty for so long, the ground must be fertile for there to be some negotiation on energy policy. I would like us to come up with a bipartisan solution. Why won't the Prime Minister listen to the member for Curtin and work with Labor on the National Energy Guarantee, a policy which the current Treasurer designed and the current Prime Minister said would lower power prices?
Members on both sides, the Prime Minister has
Thank
the
you,
call.
Mr Speaker. Well, the Leader of the Opposition referred to this policy as a Frankenstein policy, Mr Speaker. So what all that demonstrates is you can never believe anything this bloke says, Mr Speaker. He is for everything and he's against everything. You have no idea.
Prime Minister will pause for a second. The member for McEwen has already been warned. He interjects regularly. He can leave under 94A. Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and that's why, after 5 years, the Australian people have come to a conclusion on the Leader of the Labor Party, and that is he can't be trusted. He can't be trusted on anything. He will blow with the wind whichever way political opportunism follows, Mr Speaker, because that is the nature and the character of the Leader of the Opposition. If you scratch him, you won't find a belief. If you scratch him, you won't find a conviction. All you will find is rank opportunism and hubris, Mr Speaker. All you will find is unvarnished ambition, Mr Speaker, as he took down one leader after the next, Mr Speaker. And as you know,
on my left.
That's his bag, Mr Speaker. That is his bag. And that's what he's known for. And that's why people don't trust him, and that's why all of his backbenchers don't trust him either, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition cannot be trusted. He can't be trusted by his colleagues. He can't be trusted by the Australian people when it comes to the economy. He can't be trusted by the workers of Australia, who he sold out as their advocate, Mr Speaker. He sold them out as their representative as a union leader, Mr Speaker, for nothing other than his own vain ambition. The Australian people have got a clear line of sight on this bloke, Mr Speaker, and they know he cannot be trusted. By contrast, Mr Speaker, what we are saying when it comes to electricity prices is we are working to bring them down, and as the Energy Minister has clearly stated today, both AGL and Energy Australia have both taken decisions after discussions with the government which have resulted in actual real savings for hundreds of thousands of Australians on their electricity bill. Now, those opposite do not support the big stick legislation that will take it to the electricity companies to ensure we keep them in line. The Labor Party are not they're going to side with the companies that have been increasing their profits at the expense of householders, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Prime Minister on a point of order.
On direct relevance, my question went to the member for Curtin's advice and the National Energy Guarantee. Why won't the Prime Minister ever mention the member for Curtin or the National Energy Guarantee?
The Prime Minister is in order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The other thing the Leader of the Opposition plans to do is to put a 45% emissions reduction target on. Now, what we know that will do is it will increase the electricity price for every pensioner, every household, every business. It will see places like the member for Flynn knows, the Boyne Island smelter, 1,000 jobs going out of business because of the reckless policies of the Leader of the Labor Party. The Australian people will be faced with a choice at the next election: higher taxes and reckless policies on energy from the Leader of the Opposition, the Labor Party, or lower taxes, a stronger economy and the services Australians can rely on from the Liberals and the Nationals.
Just before I call the member for Boothby, I'd like to inform the House that we have joining us here on the floor of the House this afternoon a parliamentary delegation from Ireland, led by the Deputy Speaker, Pat the Cope Gallagher. On behalf of the House, we extend you a very warm welcome indeed. The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Jobs, Industrial Relations and Women. Will the minister update the House how the government's plan to keep our economy strong is guaranteeing the financial security of Australian women and their families without having to increase taxes? What are the consequences for women's financial security were an alternate course of action followed?
The Minister for Jobs, Industrial Relations and Women.
I thank the very hard-working member for Boothby for her question, because she, like so many on this side of the House, understands how crucial it is for women to be able to build their financial security, to ensure that they fulfil their full potential. Because we know that when Australian women do well, their families do well and our economy and our nation prospers. We know that financial security allows women choices and opportunity to live the life they want. They should not be forced to settle for anything less. The government has already delivered a strong and growing economy that has seen more women in work than ever before. In fact, more women in work than ever before. Of the almost 1.2 million new jobs created in this country, the majority have been taken up by women. There are more women participating in the workforce than ever before. We have a record level of workforce participation. And under our economic stewardship, we have seen the gender pay gap come down under us after having been so high under those
The Minister will
opposite.
pause. The member for Bruce will leave under 94A. The Minister has the call.
But we're not standing still, Mr Speaker. Despite the talk from all of those opposite, despite all of their talk, we are the only government, the only party, the only government to have actually delivered the first dedicated economic security statement for Australian women. As usual, it has taken a coalition government to talk about the practical policies that Australian women demand and expect, like the Career Revive initiative, that will help regional businesses to remedy barriers for women being able to access work and returning to work, and to support those who are returning to work, like the Curious Minds program, which will encourage young girls in the STEM field so that they have the skills and education for the jobs of the future. But what have we heard from those opposite? Well, last night we heard the Leader of the Opposition announce a plan to have a plan about a plan. The very fact is that those opposite are very, very good at virtue signalling, but they have not got a clue when it comes to delivery. In fact, the only thing that those opposite will be able to deliver, and that they promise to deliver, is higher taxes. $200 billion worth of higher taxes. And let us not forget the mega retiree tax, a tax that will hurt 30% more women, vulnerable women, older women. It is a shameful thing that they would do such a thing, and the coalition can be relied upon to deliver the economic security that Australian women demand and expect, not like those
The Minister's
opposite.
time has concluded. The member for Barton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Women. The Minister failed to answer the question yesterday, so I ask, does the Minister agree with herself and this Liberal government that this Liberal government is widely seen as, I quote, homophobic, anti-women and climate change deniers?
I have a concern with that question because I obviously haven't memorised every aspect of Hansard, but I'll just flag my concern now that that question can't be identical to the question of yesterday. And Manager of Opposition Business.
To the point of order.
No, look, for those interjecting, the Manager of Opposition Business actually has a job and he doesn't need your help. Manager of Opposition Business on the point of order.
You'll always help me, Christopher. Speaker, point of order. Two things. One, the question is different to the question yesterday, and secondly, the rule on the same question only applies if the question has been fully answered, which yesterday it clearly wasn't.
No, well, that's just a matter of your judgment. I mean, a question. It is. No, you can't. You don't get to score. No, sorry, Manager of Opposition Business can resume his seat for a second. You don't get to score on your judgment on how answered a question was. I mean, the practice, I could detain the House for a lengthy period of time on this, but the practice makes it very, very clear. That would only apply if a minister simply didn't say a word. I mean, the whole history of this place is well written up. Yeah, the Manager of Opposition.
Referring to that requirement in standing orders that a question cannot be asked again if it has been fully answered. So I was giving a reference to that.
Okay.
In terms of the first part of it, the question yesterday included these words but had another section added to it, and today's question is different.
All right. Okay. No, rather than just rule it out unilaterally, I just wanted to float the concern. I'll call the minister.
I actually thank the member for her question. It gives me an opportunity to be able to explain again to the House how this government is the natural government for Australian women.
Members on my left.
We are the government.
Minister, would just pause for a second. The minister, if you just pause for a second. Members on my left will cease interjecting. If members don't cease interjecting, I simply will just eject them one by one. So particularly for that level of interjection, if members can't contain themselves, they are really disrupting the House, and I'll take action. The minister has the call.
As I said, we are the government that naturally represents Australian women. We represent their hopes and aspirations. And let me explain why. We are a government that believes in lower taxes. We are a government that believes in smaller government. And we are a government— The minister will resume her seat.
The minister will resume her seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
I move that the extension allowed under standing orders of time be given for this answer.
I'll pull out the standing order, but I think you can only move that. In fact, you can only move that motion once the period of time is concluded. You can't move it. No. Anyway, we've got 2 minutes and 20 seconds. Why don't we let the minister keep going and we'll work it out, hey?
That you actually
Minister
don't want to listen to a woman who is at the dispatch box. So I will not take a lesson from you on that. As I was saying, we are a government that believes in lower taxes, unlike those opposite. We believe in smaller government. We believe that people should be able to choose their own path, and that includes Australian women. We want to help them to build their financial security, and that's why we have delivered the first ever Women's Economic Security Statement. I know it is very inconvenient.
The minister will pause for a second. The minister will pause. I'm not going to have anyone at the dispatch box shouted at continuously. The members for Brand and Hotham will leave under 94A. If the member for Wills wants to follow, he can start packing up. The minister has the call.
I know it is very inconvenient for those opposite to actually have to listen to the measures that we have delivered for Australian women. And I really am very happy about this opportunity. Measures to increase women's workforce participation, over $54.8 million over 4 years to reinstate the Time Use Survey, which will actually measure women's economic security, something, by the way, that the Labor Party abolished when they were in government. We are going to recognise women's time, whether it's in the home or in the workforce, something that they abolished when they were in government. We are improving the workplace gender and equality agency systems to make sure that we capture the right equality data to reduce the cost as well for business that is reporting, so that around about 70% of workplaces will in fact be reporting their data. We are going to have a Reducing Barriers to Work forum. This particular forum will ensure that we can have an even stronger focus on the gender pay gap because, like I said, those opposite saw the gender pay gap increase under them to 17.2%, and it has come down under us to 14.5%. We are supporting regional employers through Career Revive, as I've said, and we are providing scholarships to women to help them to be able to advance their career and give them better earning potential. And I am happy to go on.
And just for the clarity of the Manager of Opposition Business in the House, at page 528 of practice outlines it very clearly. It says after the maximum period allowed for a member's speech has expired, that it can be moved for an extension. Okay, the members on my right. Members on my right. Member for New England.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources. Will the Minister update the House on how the government's plan to keep our economy strong is providing the vital drought resilience and preparedness per package Australian farmers and regional communities rely on without having to increase taxes? What are the consequences of not supporting our farmers and their communities in this way?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for New England for his question, because he knows full well the impact the drought is having not only on his electorate of New England but as the drought envoy for this government, and understanding that while we have had rain recently, there are some drought-affected areas that haven't had none. And in fact, it's important for us all to acknowledge that one rainfall event will not break this drought. So it's important that the government continues to be agile, to not only deliver in the here and now for our farmers and our communities, because it's not just farmers that hurt through drought, it's also those small communities and small businesses in those communities that also hurt, and making sure that we also prepare for the future and learn from this drought. And that's why we're proud to say we've already put $1.9 billion on the table. And one of those key measures was increasing the farm household assistance to put money in farmers' pockets, to be able to spend it at the local butcher, the baker, the IGA, to keep the money flowing through those communities. But we've made sure that we've made that easier for them as well by investing in more rural financial counsellors. These are the angels of this drought. They help the farmers fill out these application forms and have a strategic look at their business for the future, for their future resilience and for their business profitability into years to come. So it's important that we get these people on the ground. So an extra 39 have been employed, and 37 of those have already hit the ground. Proud to say we haven't stopped. We're going to continue to make sure that we deliver this in an agile way. But it's also about making sure that we broaden our investment into the communities by making a $1 million investment in each local shire, for those shire councils to invest in projects to build infrastructure to employ local tradies and to procure a lot of those materials from local hardware stores to keep those businesses going through the tough times. But looking further that, building on the National Water Infrastructure Fund, an extra $500 million to complement the $500 we've already put for key water infrastructure projects around the nation. We've already started shovel-ready projects of eight around the nation already, but looking to farmers as well, giving them $50 million in rebates to put on-farm water infrastructure projects, to build the resilience and preparedness of their farms for the drought, and also investing in one of our greatest natural resources, the Great Artesian Basin, an extra $30 million to continue the capping and piping to make sure that resource is there for the future. But, Mr Speaker, one of the proudest things we've done as a government is for the first time in this nation's history, we will have a nationally coordinated drought approach. And that is underpinned by a $5 billion future fund, a $5 billion future fund that will give it a dividend year in, year out from 2020 that will invest in new research and development, in infrastructure to build the resilience and preparedness of our agricultural sector, but prepare and protect our regional communities. The story of agriculture is a good one. The story of agriculture is just to add rain. We are proudly a $60 billion industry, and with this investment we'll go a lot further.
Just before I call the member for Port Adelaide, I'd also like to inform the House that joining us in the gallery this afternoon is the Australian Political Exchange Council's 26th delegation from the People's Republic of China. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you. The member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister agree with himself when he said, and I quote, "The National Energy Guarantee achieves lower electricity prices"?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The misrepresentation of the National Energy Guarantee as being some measure that the opposition has somehow taken from the coalition, I think, is deeply misleading to the Australian people. And I'll tell you why. Because in the proposal that was considered by the government, the emissions reduction target was 26%. It wasn't 45%. The Labor Party cannot use the National Energy Guarantee as some sort of Trojan horse to legislate a 45% emissions reduction target, Mr Speaker. The Australian public should not be fooled by this lie, Mr Speaker, because it is a very tricky and shifty lie from the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker. Very tricky and very shifty. 45% emissions reduction targets will turbocharge electricity prices high, Mr Speaker. That will hit pensioners, it will hit families, it will hit small businesses, it will hit the agriculture industry, it will help the smelting industry, it will hit businesses and regions all across the country, Mr Speaker. If you're interested in taking electricity prices down, you do not have reckless targets when it comes to managing your emissions. We have a sensible target. It's 26%. We're committed to it, and we will continue to meet it. We will have met Kyoto 1, we will meet Kyoto 2, and we will ensure we meet the Paris reductions as well, Mr Speaker, by 2030. We have sensible targets. The Labor Party has a reckless target. And as we heard from the member for Isaacs, that will, it is quite possible, include a carbon tax from the Labor Party. They refuse to rule it out. They've ruled it out in the past. They've ruled it in the past. They've done it, and we were the ones who had to get rid of it. A 45% emissions reduction target is a job-destroying, economy-destroying tax on electricity, Mr Speaker, which will undermine the strength of our economy. Now, this is important, because it's the strength of our economy which delivers hospitals. It's the strength of our economy that delivers schools and affordable medicines. Affordable medicines that when Labor was in power they could not fund because they could not manage money and they could not fund a budget, Mr Speaker. In next year's budget, the first surplus budget in 12 years, Mr Speaker, our budget will fund those medicines, it will fund hospitals, it will fund schools, and it will do so without higher taxes and will do so without reckless targets that only undermine our economy.
The member for Forrest.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the minister update the House how the government's plan to keep our economy strong is guaranteeing the essential services Australians rely on without having to increase taxes, including supporting Australia's science agencies?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Forrest for her question, and I know how passionate she is about science and technology. Mr Speaker, the Liberal National Government is absolutely committed to a strong and growing science and technology sector, and we are able to do that because we have built a strong economy. Mr Speaker, today the Prime Minister and I announced the establishment of the National Science and Technology Council. That is the peak advisory body that is to support the Prime Minister and other ministers on science and technology. It will focus on the key science and technology challenges that are facing Australia, and it will ensure that the government is receiving the best independent advice possible. Mr Speaker, the coalition government supports science and technology. We have leading agencies, science agencies here in Australia: CSIRO, ANSTO, aims with world-leading scientists here, and the coalition government continues to invest in them. Mr Speaker, the coalition government has invested $1.5 billion more in science agencies than Labor did. We have invested more money, $97 million more in CSIRO, $126 million more in ANSTO, and $53 million more for the Australian Institute of Marine Science. Now, the scientific advances that these investments support is going to attract talent. It's going to build our skills, it's going to create jobs, it's going to unlock discoveries, and it is going to enable Australian industry and businesses to thrive. For example, the coalition government invested about $520 million in the Australian synchrotron through the National Innovation and Science Agenda. A new technique has been now developed by Australian researchers that will assist in the early detection and diagnosis of breast cancer. And that was all thanks to the strong economy that the government has been able to build, which enables us to invest in our leading science agencies. And on top of that, we have invested $41 million to establish the Australian Space Agency, which is going to grow jobs from 10,000 to an additional 20,000 by the year 2030. And let me say this, Mr Speaker, while those opposite were staring into space, the coalition government was the government that made space a reality.
Members on both sides. The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Does the Treasurer agree with himself when he said, and I quote, "If you believe in lower power prices, if you want to see Australian households $550 a year better off, if you want to see the wholesale price down by 20%, if you want to stand side by side with big employers across the country, you get behind the National Energy Guarantee"?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, as the Prime Minister made very clear, the Leader of the Opposition, when the National Energy Guarantee was being discussed, called it a Frankenstein policy, Mr Speaker. And in doing so, he revealed everything that he is about, just politics. It's all about politics. It's not about reducing power prices. And do you know what the Labor Party's record on power prices when they were last in government? Power prices doubled, Mr Speaker. They doubled. And the member for Port Adelaide comes from the state where they had that big experiment, Mr Speaker. A big failed experiment where they had a blackout and businesses saw their power prices rise and families were hurt by higher power prices. So, Mr Speaker, the member for Hume, the Prime Minister, outside of politics, are making a real difference in lowering power prices, Mr Speaker. Because on the 1st of July this year, power prices came down in Queensland, South Australia and New South Wales. And as the Energy Minister said, AGL have just reduced their standing offers, which will see 150,000 households up to $180 a year better off, Mr Speaker, and 27,000 businesses up to $340 a year better off as a result of policies that we are taking and the energy companies are reacting. Now, the wholesale power price is down about 20% year on year, Mr Speaker, and we have avoided the gas shortfall which was created by those opposite when they ignored the warnings from AEMO and in their own gas policy when they were last in government. Now, as the Energy Minister has made clear, we have a broad suite of reforms. A broad suite of reforms which include the default price, Mr Speaker, and backing new generation, Mr Speaker, and backing new generation and dealing with a market failure, Mr Speaker. So we have taken the advice of the ACCC and we have a policy that will not only reduce power prices but will also reduce emissions, which are at its lowest level on a per capita and GDP basis in 28 years. There hasn't been as much investment in renewables as there has been under a coalition government, Mr Speaker. These are inconvenient truths from the Labor Party. So the Labor Party, when they have an energy policy, it's about a 45% recklessly high target which the Business Council of Australia said will be a wrecking ball through the economy. Only the coalition can be trusted to reduce people's power prices.
The member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Health. Will the minister update the House on how the government's plan to keep Australia's economy strong is guaranteeing affordable access to life-changing medicines Australians depend upon, without having to increase taxes? And is the minister aware of any alternative approaches to the supply of treatments recommended by medical experts?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Goldstein, who's been a great advocate for the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme and in particular for better access to new cancer treatments such as immunotherapies. On that front, I was very privileged recently to meet with Peter Suffolk. Peter Suffolk was a gentleman who had been diagnosed with non-small cell lung cancer. It had spread to other parts of his body. He was given 6 months to live. That was 6 years ago, however, that he was given 6 months to live. He was one of the first Australians to receive Keytruda, one of the new immunotherapies, through a trial program. I met him on the day that we were listing Keytruda, only 2 months after it had been recommended by the PBAC for inclusion on the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme. This medicine for non-small cell lung cancer will mean that 850 patients will save up to $188,000 a year and that they have the prospect of a long life. It is a profoundly important thing, something of immense value that you can only do if you've got a strong economy which actually allows you to deliver these essential services. This is the human face of a strong economy. This is the human face of medical research. It's the human face of all of the different things that we do. And so what Peter said to me that day is the fact that every Australian who has this condition and qualifies will now have access under the PBS is an absolute gift. And he gave thanks that day for what we were able to do. Now, I'm asked whether or not there are any alternatives. We know from history, sadly, that it has not always been the case that new medicines are listed when the medical experts recommend them. We know that in the 2011 budget, the then government deferred the listing of new medicines until fiscal circumstances would permit. That's what happens when you can't run the economy and you can't run a budget. And I was doing a little bit of research and I discovered that following that decision, 60 groups put out a statement: vital life-saving medicines are being shelved by the federal government just to keep the budget in surplus. They were right about the first, but the surplus was never delivered. And what they went on to say was affordable medicines and vaccines that save and prolong lives are being denied to some of the most vulnerable, chronically ill Australians by a short-sighted decision by the government to disregard the recommendations of the PBAC. And who are these groups? Cancer Voices, the Lung Foundation, the Breast Cancer Network of Australia, MS Australia, Alzheimer's Australia and another 55 groups that I plan to explore in the coming days. So it was the patients who were denied access to medicines by a government and a party that couldn't manage the economy and they couldn't manage the
Members on both sides. Members on both sides. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can he confirm that this government last year cancelled an entire week of parliament, this year shut down parliament, and next year will come to parliament just 10 days in 8 months, creating the first part-time parliament in Australian history? If ordinary workers skip work like this, they'd get the sack. Why is it there's always one rule for this divided, dysfunctional and chaotic government and another rule for everyone else?
The Leader of the Opposition's time has concluded. The Prime Minister
Thank you,
has the
Mr
call.
Speaker. What I can confirm is the budget is being brought forward by a month, and the sitting schedule has been prepared to reflect the bringing forward of the budget by a month, Mr Speaker, and the number of sitting days that will take place that are scheduled between the start of the the year next year, and the 18th of May is exactly the same as it is this year, Mr Speaker. We're bringing the budget forward a month, and in that time before the budget, the Treasurer and I and the members of the Expenditure Review Committee and the Cabinet will be preparing a surplus budget, Mr Speaker. That's what we'll be doing at the start of next year, Mr Speaker. Our government will be delivering and preparing the first surplus budget in over a decade, Mr Speaker. That's what we'll be hard at work doing at the beginning of next year. Those opposite haven't delivered a surplus budget from the year Taylor Swift was born, Mr Speaker, in 1989, and now they want to shake it off, Mr Speaker, as if there's some sort of way of walking away from their failure to deliver a surplus when they were in government, Mr Speaker. Up the back there we've got the member for Lilley, apparently the world's greatest treasurer. The world's greatest treasurer. Well, I'll tell you what, this treasurer over here is going to deliver a surplus in April, Mr Speaker, and that puts him ahead of every treasurer that preceded him, Mr Speaker, other than Treasurer Costello. Mr Speaker, I was proud to do the lead-up work, but I absolutely know this treasurer is going to be delivering the first budget surplus in more than a decade because of the hard work that this government knows about what you have to do to get expenditure under control. And expenditure under control, which means we have the slowest growth in expenditure of any government in more than 50 years, Mr Speaker. So we got expenditure under control, and we've also got taxes under control. We'll put a speed limit on taxes, Mr Speaker, because that's how you manage a budget. The Australian people know that this Leader of the Labor Party can't manage money, he can't manage a budget, he can't run a stronger economy, and that means Australians can't be assured of the medicines that they rely on, the hospital funding they rely on, the schools funding they rely on. Instead, this Leader of the Labor Party will give them $200 billion in higher taxes. He was coming after their house prices with his abolition of negative gearing, the increases in capital gains tax. He's coming after retirees with their retirees tax, $5 billion a year, 30% more women hit by it than men, Mr Speaker. He's coming after your earnings by putting up an increase, Mr Speaker, in their personal taxes. This will be the highest taxing Leader of the Labor Party in Australia's history if he has opportunity to become Prime Minister of this country.
Prime Minister's time has concluded. Prime Minister.